Thanks very much, Delma, and we're all very grateful to the huge amount of work done by Delma and others in organising today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this panel. We're here today to talk about, amongst other things, the current joint project between UNCITRAL, UNIDROIT and the Hague Conference on Private International Law. So those three organisations are currently involved in a joint project to produce a guide, which we'll talk about more later. Today, to help discuss this and expand upon its impact, perhaps in Australia and elsewhere, I'm very pleased to introduce Roger Wilkins and also Justin Hogan-Doran. So we are also going to have a video presentation from Professor Laura Gama, who is in Brazil and unable to be here today. But if I can introduce first our two speakers who are present today. Justin Hogan-Doran is a barrister who is practicing in Sydney. He has many accomplishments in his credentials. He is an expert in international arbitration, also cross-border insolvency, and also has been nominated as Lawyer of the Year, I understand, for shipping and maritime law. He's a captain in the Australian Army Reserve, an Akiko Fellow, and also an adjunct senior lecturer at Sydney University. Roger Wilkins, AO, is a former Secretary of the Attorney General's Department for a lengthy period of 6 years. He also led reform as a Director General of the New South Wales Cabinet Office and also as Director General of the New South Wales Ministry of Arts. So we're very honoured today to have two speakers to discuss the impact of the joint project. The joint project has not yet issued a draft to the public for comment, but we do have some information about what the content of it will be. Perhaps before we start discussing the joint project, there is sort of perhaps a need to talk about why such a project is required and what it might mean for Australia. And I want to first invite Roger to perhaps outline the Australian landscape and his views about what needs to be done in Australia, in addition to and in conjunction with perhaps the joint project, to raise awareness of the issues involved.
That's a nice segue, actually, Lisa. So thank you, first of all, for the invitation and the opportunity to participate here. When Tim Castle approached me about this, I said, well, I don't think much is happening with this, actually, Tim. I'd be surprised if things actually have moved all that much by the time we have the seminar. And lo and behold, I'm correct. But Laura is going to give a summary, and I'm sure there are speculation that we can engage in about this project and what it might mean. But he said, well, that's not a problem. He said, why don't you just come down and talk to us on this topic with special reference to anything you know. You can speak widely on a varied range of topics, and it suits me because I'm not an expert on this area, although I'm on the Governing Council of UNIDROIT, so I do have some insight into this. And when we come to have a bit of a discussion, I do have some views on the use of soft law in this area, but I thought it might be useful, Lisa, just to sort of start with saying a little bit about, I guess, perspective that my perspective on some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today more generally. As well as the positions you've indicated, I've also been the president of the Financial Action Task Force, which has meant that my real expertise is in terms of regulation of money laundering and terrorism financing. As you said, I'm sort of as the notes show, I'm also the president, the chair of the FinTel Alliance, which is banks, etc., which is an interesting position to be in. The Commonwealth Bank sitting at the table. But the key to context in which we're all operating is globalisation, and I say that not meaning to be glib, but it is creating an increasingly porous environment in terms of the economy, and you can see that the implications of that for people who were sitting in my position as Secretary of the Attorney General's Department, it was creating issues around regulatory arbitrage, and I saw that in spades in relation to finance when I was working for Citibank, and then on the other side when I was looking at money laundering and terrorism financing. It's creating huge transaction costs, and I have to say, now that I've had a bit to do with big law firms, they're the last people who want to solve this problem because they're generating quite a lot of fees from that. And it's generating a lot of inefficiency in terms of uncertainty, in terms of the sort of contracts and transactions that we enter into. So if I speaking to my counterparts as heads of justice departments around the world, I guess we put these issues of regulatory arbitrage, transaction costs, uncertainty and inefficiency at sort of the top of the list of things that we would worry about, which concern policymakers in the justice sphere around the world. And we talked about this sort of stuff a lot. I mean, the clear way to deal with these issues, in some cases arbitrage, or if you want to think that regulatory competition is not a bad thing. In some cases, it's a very bad thing when you think about money laundering and terrorism financing. So we can't be too categorical about that, but it is usually a good thing to try and get some uniform agreement, namely treaties of various sorts, which is what this group is very interested in. UNCITRAL, UNIDROIT, organisations like that, but not only, FATF, treaties on the environment, whatever, to try and agree common standards and have those implemented around the world. That's easier said than done, I've got to tell you, having presided over the FATF. It is like herding cats and more than that. It's very difficult to get agreements of that sort. And then to actually have them implemented and enforced is another step. So very few international organisations take that much interest in terms of the implementation. In the FATF, we actually did do country reviews on a periodic basis, actually sent in teams to see if not only the laws were in place, but they were being enforced and look for performance indicators and those things. With mixed results. I think Australia, however, coming back to, is lagging. I mean, despite the fact that all these people like the nice Secretary General of UNCITRAL will congratulate Australia on various things, I think Australia is lagging in this area, and it's an area in which we shouldn't be lagging because we are a medium-sized power in the rule of law. We are a trading country. We rely heavily on international transactions. I just want to throw out there on the table some ideas about the sorts of things that I think maybe we should be doing in relation to private international law, conflicts of law. Some of them are controversial, some of them are sort of flying kites, some of them are not. But I do think Australia has to do a lot more than we have been currently doing. And I know Tim and I have had some discussions about various things, aspects of this that he might want to raise as well. But let me just go through a list of about 7 things. First of all, I think we need a consolidated Federal Private International Law Act. I think it needs to deal with jurisdiction, international service, evidence conventions, choice of court conventions, international wills convention, recognition, enforcement of foreign judgments. I think we should try and settle that. At the moment, we have a balkanized system. It's unclear. The states and territories are still theoretically part of this. Federalism is what has driven a lot of our understanding of conflicts of law and private international law in this country. Anyway, I think consolidated Federal Private International Law Act. I think we need to improve judicial training in relation to international commercial law standards, both soft law and applicable law. There have been errors, and I won't go over them in the passed at Supreme Court level, and that's, I just don't, and I'll come to questions about education in a moment, but I do think judicial education is important in this respect. I mean, I remember seeing some judgments that were just plain wrong and didn't actually understand the law. Better still, and this is an idea that we played around with when I was secretary, is having a federal international commercial court. And we looked at this particular relation of international arbitration, and but we ended up leaving the question moot and leaving Supreme Courts to also have jurisdiction in this area. And there are all sorts of problems with the Constitution and superannuation and appointment of judges. But it seems to me it's not insuperable, and you could do it. And we did think about designating the federal court as the court responsible for the arbitration, under the arbitration act. We can go ahead with that with Supreme Courts of States as well. But that's something I think that's worth considering when you think about the expertise in this area. And I'm sure Justin's in a better position to understand who the experts are in this area. I mean, it's not, you're not going to find Donald around in all different sorts of courts around the country, and find them probably in Sydney at the federal court. The fourth thing I think is re-engaging better with international fora, despite the fact that a lot of people with using money out of their own pockets go along and participate in a lot of these working groups, etc., with UNCITRAL, to some extent UNIGUA, the Hague Conference. And then there are organisations that are equally important, like APEC, and some of the organisations that come out of some of these trade agreements. Australia really needs to be there at the table. And I know it's a long way to go, and we're a relatively small group, small population, but somebody made the point that we do punch above our weight, and when we do attend, we do contribute. But we need to actually be there. And I think that's important, actually. The fifth thing is, I think we should include international commercial law technical legal assistance as part of Australia's aid program, particularly in the Asia Pacific, to improve efficiency of business and form commercial relationships in our region. I think the whole process is of doing that is extremely important in terms of growing capability and capacity. This doesn't work unless you get that capability in the jurisdictions that we're talking about. People, as I said with the FATF, people sign these pieces of paper and then they don't do anything, or they don't even pass a law. They don't actually understand what things are happening. The sixth thing that I was going to talk about, which is bugbear of mine, I remember that when private international law or conflicts of law was a compulsory subject at universities, and I think it should still be a compulsory subject at university. I don't understand how in a world which is moving in the direction which this world is moving, how you can possibly not do that. I mean, it seems to be madness. Anyway, the final thing that I just wanted to talk about, I think that domestic law, this is a question really about standards, I guess, international standards, and the extent to which in our domestic laws we actually reflect international standards, norms. I don't think we do it quickly enough, and I don't think we do it widely enough. And we're constantly reinventing the wheel at a legislative level. And we're reluctant to embrace these international standards. I think that's really an important presumption that we should build into the way in which we do legislation. I saw a huge number of cases in which it would be very simple. Take therapeutic goods. So we go through more or less the same process that they go through in the United Kingdom, in the United States on therapeutic goods. Why do we do that? that's mad. We should actually just adopt those standards. But there are standards too that come out of a lot of these treaties that we've been talking about as well that aren't incorporated into this framework. It just seems to me that creates huge costs. It just adds to the complexity. I'm going to leave my remarks there and just throw that stuff out there. I'm happy to talk about this project. As far as I can see, it's really in danger of just creating another document and another set of words that we then have to reconcile with the three that we've already got. But anyway.
I think that's a very valid fear, actually. One of the issues in this area, as you probably well know, is there's a proliferation of documents out there, both hard law and soft law, and how they all fit together becomes then an issue for those who are interested in the area and even understand a great deal of it. Sometimes you have to think very carefully about, well, where are the overlaps, and do these documents necessarily work together, or do you need to choose that one and not that one if you're going to go down that road? So one of the things we hope that this project perhaps will do is to reconcile that and provide a bit of a roadmap, if you like, for practitioners in particular to assist them in having a better understanding of those overlaps. And as I say, we'll hear more from one of the people on the project working group about exactly what that's going to do. I just want to mention one point which Roger brought up before we hear from Justin, and that's particular errors that might come up in Australian understanding and cases in Australia on some of these instruments. One of my bugbears, and I'll mention it now and then leave it alone, is the Play Corp error, if I can put it that way. Play Corp was a case in Victoria which unfortunately made the statement that the implementing legislation for the CISG, which says that the CISG shall apply where it's inconsistent with the domestic sale of goods or domestic law, meant that where the court felt that there was no inconsistency, they didn't need to look at the CISG, but could just apply domestic law. Now that clearly wasn't the intent of the convention or the implementing legislation, but it's been read that way in Play Corp, and that proposition has been picked up and repeated in a number of cases since at the state level. Now that's plainly an error, which I think does need to be addressed at some point directly head on, so that it doesn't keep being repeated. That's just one thing I wanted to mention. Those lines of error can go unchallenged, sometimes particularly in a federal system like ours, where you're not necessarily reviewing particular things at each level. Now, you all received, or hopefully have got, a handout, which is the HCCH handout. If you haven't, there's more outside. But what that is a document from a previous project, which the Hague Conference on Private International Law did undertake. And Justin's going to talk a little bit to the work of the Hague Conference, and the Hague Conference Board is one of the three bodies that's involved with the joint project.
Sure. The document you have in front of you is this here, and it lists the plethora of international instruments coming out of the three bodies that are involved in this project, the Hague Conference, IDRA, and UNCITRAL. Just by listing them, which are a combination of conventions, model laws, principles, instruments, some of which, many of which overlap one with the other, some of which leave gaps to be filled by, say, hard law leaving gaps to be filled by soft law that won't speak to matters that are expected to be dealt with by hard law. But one of the tasks that was set by the three bodies a few years ago was to begin the process of examining all these instruments, putting together in one document these instruments in a way that allowed somebody to understand the architecture of a subject field. So, for example, in 2012, the predecessor to the document is supposedly going to be coming out on the issue of international contracts with a focus on sales. The document put out by the three bodies of texts on security interests, which mostly picked up the documents that you see in in section 1, capital A, banking, credit, finance and solvency, as well as a few other documents instruments sprinkled through the document, including on trusts. And if you ever go and look at the document that was put together by the three bodies, it's, and I don't mean this in any way to denigrate the document, it's a dummy's guide to all of these documents. What are they each of them basically about? But then using comparative criteria, what are the scope of application, overlap, possible inconsistency or references between them to show so that someone's engaging with this area, you see the list of relevant instruments, understand what their key provisions are, and understand how they interact. And by doing so, at least give a practitioner or anybody else who's interested a sense of the architecture, so that when they're approaching a particular area, such as security interests, which is the 2012, or international commercial contracts, which is the new project, they're not in that Rumsfeld era of there are unknown unknowns, and I don't know what I don't know. It gives you a sense of, as I said, of the architecture of an area, of a particular area, and how the different instruments, whether they're hard law or soft law, interact. Now, the 2012 document has tables and summary schedules. It's not a text designed that requires heavy reading. It's a rough guide and a checklist, as it were, that allows you to look at it, and you can find it online. The project on international commercial contracts, although the exact content hasn't yet been set, it'll be focused on sales, as I said, and looking at this document is particularly going to be concerned with the documents starting at the bottom of page 3, law of contracts, obviously, with and then running over the page, including the CIS, and then specific contracts, section F, with a focus on the sales section. And there may be some parts on carriage of goods, which is on the top of page 5, and maybe a couple other documents that are selected from out of this long list of instruments that would be pertinent. Now, I'd certainly embrace what Roger said, which is that the teaching of private national law, but also international law, international private law, those instruments that regulate private conduct, such as international sale of goods, is, I think, still quite deficient in our law schools. It's true that private national law as a basic course should be taught at the undergraduate level, that's my view. But in the same way that we've been hearing a lot of talk recently about education at the secondary level, having themes that run across all subjects, whether it's sustainability or Indigenous relations or whatever, wherever you can fit it in. It seems that in our teaching of basic subjects of law schools, such as contract law or sales, the international components might get mentioned at the back end of the course, sometimes of the, well, it won't be in the exam, but just so you know, there are these instruments out there, you might one day engage with it, possibly, and that's the sum total of legal education on international instruments for 95% of the lawyers who go out to practice. What there should be, in my view, is a thematic requirement that in all subjects to which it could be relevant, that international instruments, especially in private law, it is a theme of the course and is an examinable theme of the course, so that practitioners, future academics, future advisors, future in-house counsel, don't just know that there might be something out there, but they don't know what they don't know. They know what is there. There are at least known unknowns, as well as hopefully a few known knowns, so that they can engage with it. And if I can give a practical example, before I do that, the 2012 instrument was mostly directed at legislators and policymakers, because when it comes to the creation of security interests in property in the context of transactions, unless it's done voluntarily, it's often imposed by law, regulated by law, and it's primarily concerned with legislators. But when it comes to principles or instruments concerning international commercial contracts, where parties have the ability to opt into instruments freely as part of their party autonomy, or they're in an opt-out scenario such as CIS, where they have to turn their mind to whether or not they are going to be subject to a certain regime. The next guide, we're told, is going to be focused perhaps more on the judiciary, practitioners, and even private enterprises, which I assume would mean in-house counsel or people with some familiarisation or familiarity with business law who are running private enterprises. So it should be a document that is picked up by those people rather than just policymakers and academics. And where the rubber really hits the road on this is particularly for those who are increasingly, as practitioners, involved in international commercial arbitration. As an example, I'm involved in an arbitration at the moment where goods, a snow-making machine was shipped from Canada to Australia. Apparently, this snow-making machine can make snow in warm conditions, up to 25 degrees Celsius. My client, I suppose I'm acting for one of the clients, which is the Australian end of the transaction, describes it as, and he's a whiskey drinker, as my first $1 million ice maker. It doesn't make snow, it makes ice. It doesn't make snow for 24 hours, it made ice for 3 hours and then seized up. That's his version of events. But the contract was put together by the parties with no lawyers' involvement. They took some things from the internet and adapted it, which is always a wonderful way of putting together a contract. There's no choice of law provision, but as it happens, CISC does apply for the export of this particular product from Quebec, I think it is Quebec, yes, to New South Wales. But the real issue between the parties is not about the contract, it's about pre-contractual representations that is not regulated by CISC. We complain about violations of Australian consumer law and we allege fraud. The Quebec parties understandably know nothing about Australian consumer law, why would they? And obviously resisting the question of fraud. But the arbitrator sitting in the middle of this has, in an ad hoc arbitration, has to a large extent a free choice about what choice of law rules he, in this case, is going to apply to work out which laws he's going to apply to the allegations about pre-contractual negotiations. And then what instruments will he, using those choice of law rules, actually apply? Now, my client does want an opinion on where do we think this arbitration is going to go. Now, I'm sure that question's being asked on the other side, where we've got this free range of choice, which could involve the gap filling in this dispute, because the parties didn't provide for it, of what instruments are going to be applied to resolve this private dispute, which is connected with the international sale. Now, if you were a practitioner and you were asked this question, your first problem can be the complete lack of knowledge of the architecture of international commercial contract law. How do you write an opinion? Would you be willing to write an opinion where you're engaging with an area that there are a lot of, for you, unknowns? Practitioners don't like writing opinions about that. And that flows through to meaning that clients are operating without the benefit of opinions, or they're so heavily qualified that they're useless to them. That reduces certainty, and we all know that for business, certainty has an intrinsic value all on its own. Documents such as this and projects like this are useful because we all know from studying subjects at university that by having someone who knows a lot more about it than you usually knows something and you know nothing, can explain the architecture of the law of contract, the architecture of the law of tort, the law of torts, so that you can engage your critical mind because there are no unknown unknowns, there are no knowns and known unknowns, and you can engage with the material in a critical way, and that allows you to formulate opinions, or at least attempt to do so. That understanding of the architecture is very important, particularly when there are so many international instruments out there, and particularly when we're talking about soft law, where in addition to the instruments that these bodies put together, there are all kinds of draft statements and promulgations and declarations by private law bodies or associations or bar associations around the world to supplement the soft law in this area. From my perspective as a practitioner, if I'm going to write an opinion, if I have from essentially the 3 leading institutions in this field in the world, a single document that explains what is the architecture and how does this all fit together, then if I wanted to write an opinion as to what, if the arbitrator goes down the route of looking at these instruments, how could or should he engage with these instruments and resolve the apparent conflict or overlap between them? And at least I could write an opinion anyone engaging could write an opinion that discusses the relation between these instruments in a way that says, well, if someone later complains their opinion is wrong, you can at least say, well, I followed a guide that was put forward by the three leading bodies to explain it. And I would feel more comfortable as a practitioner, obviously, writing an opinion about where I think this open-ended question is going to go in this particular context. If I have a document in front of me that gives me that architecture and the explanation of the relation between the component parts. And that's why I think a document like this, that even though it might appear to be a somewhat simple document, and it might appear to those who are very learned in this field to be a dummy's guide, it's actually an incredibly useful document. And it also means when we get to the rubber hitting the road at the ultimate hearing, that you could put the document in front of the arbitrator himself, who may not be familiar with this, and say, here's a guide, this is the lay of the land, and we're going to have a debate about which of these instruments are going to apply and why in circumstances where you don't want to choose Australian consumer law and you don't want to choose Quebec law in this contractual dispute between a Quebec party and an Australian party, focusing upon pre-contractual representations, some of which were made in Quebec, some of which were made in Australia, some of which were made from Quebec to Australia, some were made from Australia to Quebec. So I think projects like this often seem somewhat innocuous are actually, I think, incredibly important.
Thank you very much. I have to wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. One thing I've just observed is the wonderful thing about international sales law is you get all this inside information about wonderful things like snowmakers or ice makers, as in your case, and that never fails to amuse me. In regard to education, I think judicial education is one area we do need to perhaps start focusing a little bit more on in this particular field. I'm presently involved with as an academic, trying to ramp up the education of our undergraduates and our JD students in engaging directly with some of these international instruments during the compulsory part of their course, rather than as some option that they may or may not choose, and probably, as you say, 95% of them won't choose the option that leads them down the path of learning more about it. So my current interest is in implementing, and indeed at Monash I have implemented at the undergraduate level within their contracts course to learn about CISG or CISC, to learn about the Unidroit principles side by side when they're learning their domestic law, so that they can better understand domestic law itself and why it is in the shape it is and what the alternatives are, but also learn about what else is there, and perhaps that may well inform their choices as professionals when they get out and practice. To support that, and this may be of help at some stage in the future, we are, a group of us are working on a textbook on Australian contract law that also incorporates these instruments within it as part of the core text, side by side with all of the topics, so it won't be left down the back for someone who may well get there, which is usually not the students. So I want to move now, if we can, to the video from Laurel and just say a little bit about Laurel. I think the important thing we need to remember about this project, as Justin touched on, is that the involvement of the three key international bodies in the project gives it a certain legitimacy that we don't necessarily otherwise see when one of them speaks to perhaps their instrument and or how that touches on the others. The fact that the three of them got together really lends something more to it. We're going to now hear from Professor Laurel Gama Jr. He's an adjunct professor at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He's also a title partner of Benedjugorje, Gama and Carvalho Brito in Rio, and has been a rapporteur and is now a member of the CISG Advisory Council and was the rapporteur for Opinion 17. He's been on the working group of Unidroit principles for 2 years, and the working group of the 2015 Hague Principles, and a member of the ICC as well as the Brazilian Arbitration Body. That ideally places him for work on this project, and so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Gama.
Just before I hit play for the video, I have to make a side remark. This is the most time-efficient conference I've ever seen. That's the difference between a professional and an academic conference, I think. With academics, you just cannot stop them. Everyone is on time and early, which is fabulous. It also means that we will watch the video, and then we will go into hopefully some lively discussions and then critical brainstorming. And I expect people to have a lot of questions also about what Laura will speak about, so that will be left to you because he won't be able to answer to anything. But don't hold back just because a question pops up from what Laura will present. The panel will deal with those questions as
And
well.
also I should mention that Lara, there will be consultation period once the draft comes out, so they're interested in comments that you might have on this project as well, so we can report back to you.
Absolutely. So the initial plan was for this guide to have the first draft released to key stakeholders at the end of May, and that's why we planned it, that it was in principle nicely aligned with the time of the seminar, but we were being optimistic because that group wasn't as efficient as this one, and they are just lagging behind a little bit with the work.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am both pleased and honored to have the opportunity to talk to you about this exciting project. I would have been much happier if I were with you in Canberra, listening and participating in the debates of the 4th annual UNCCA seminar. But today's technology has afforded us the means to be together, even when we are more than 8,000 miles away. In my brief presentation, I will cover the essence of the joint project called A Guide to Uniform Legal Instruments in the area of international commercial contracts, with a focus on sales. In doing that, I will point out the project's goals, the working group's tasks, and the current developments of the guide. As you all know, in 2016, the governing bodies of the Hague Conference on Private International Law, the UNIDROIT and the UNCITRAL, approved the start of a joint project. This project consists in drafting a roadmap for users of uniform legal instruments relating to international commercial contracts, in particular, contracts for the sale of goods. Over the past few decades, these international bodies, as well as a number of other entities, have drawn up a large variety of legislative and non-legislative instruments in this field. Normativity in the ambit of international commercial contract law has become abundant, and the constant growth of international trade entails the popping up of multiple legal harmonization initiatives all around the world. Today, there are so many international uniform legal instruments that the user unfamiliar with them can easily get lost. Among them, I am certain that you can easily recall the CISG, the UN Instruments on Electronic Commerce, the Hague Principles on the Choice of Law in International Commercial Contracts, and the UNIDROIT Principles. Regional initiatives may also come to our minds. This is the case of the Inter-American Instruments developed by the Organization of the American States, the OHADA Instruments in Africa, the European Union initiatives, and several soft laws, such as the Latin American and the Asian Principles on Contract Law. These are just a few examples of the many different instruments currently in place. Abundance of international instruments comes at a price, which is the fragmentation of the law governing international commercial contracts. Parties trading in the global arena have to struggle to conciliate competing hard law and soft law instruments potentially applying to their transactions, let alone judges, arbitrators in dispute resolution processes. The CISG and the UNIDROIT principles are generally recognized as converging tools for legal harmonization of international commercial contracts. In turn, the Hague Principles have established a comprehensive choice of law regime for giving effect to party autonomy. we can all benefit from the substantive overlap and cross-fertilization of these relevant sources of international law. This is why these instruments will be the core of the Future Guide. The Future Guide's purpose is to clarify the relationship among the CISG, the UNIDROIT principles, and the Hague Principles, as well as other instruments with a view to further promoting their adoption and use. This joint initiative will essentially guide judges, legislators, arbitrators, and legal counsel in identifying, understanding, and applying these sources of international commercial law. The guide will not go into much detail about each instrument. It is not intended to reinterpret the rules of those instruments, nor will it possess a normative character. It will just provide an overview of the fundamental features of the CISG, the UNIDROIT principles, and the Hague Principles, and the comparative understanding of their coverage. Illustrations will be created to explain the practical application of these different instruments to the targeted users. The Hague Conference, the UNIDROIT, and UNCITRAL have formed a working group of experts to draft the guide. I am very honored to be part of this group, despite all the extra work that comes along with it. The group includes Professor Ana Veneziano, representing UNIDROIT, Ms. Ning Zhao, representing the Hague Conference, and Mr. Luca Castellani from UNCITRAL. In addition, we have Professor Pilar Perales from Spain, Professor Hiro Sono from Japan, Professor Neil Cohen from the US, and Professor Stefan Fogenauer from Germany. They are not only bright scholars, but also very easygoing fellows. In April 2017, a first draft table of contents of the Future Guide circulated among the members of the working group. The various topics were then assigned to small groups within the working group. In October 2017, the working group had a meeting in Frankfurt, kindly hosted by Professor Fogenauer at the Max Planck Institute. On that occasion, we had the opportunity to discuss and further develop the outline. The guide's purpose is to lead the user across a range of relevant issues, from choice of law to identification among the existing texts of those most suitable for each type of transaction. The guide will be a practical and useful tool for various sectors, including legislators, judiciaries, practitioners, and private companies. To this end, it will be written in straightforward language and include flowcharts in each chapter. At the working group, we have been expressly instructed to refrain from writing an academic work. The guide will include an introduction dealing with the origin of the project and its focus, which is sales contracts and other contracts relevant to international commercial transactions, such as carriage of goods, payments, financing, and so on. The second chapter deals with determination of the law applicable to international commercial contracts. It addresses 4 different topics. First, determination of the governing law by direct application of a uniform law treaty. Second, determination of the governing law by parties' choice. Third, determination of the governing law in the absence of parties' choice. And fourth, mandatory provisions. The third chapter of the guide is on the substantive law of sales. This includes an analysis of the main features of the CISG, the Limitation Convention, the UNIDROIT principles, the UNCITRAL uniform rules on contract clauses for an agreed sum, due upon failure of performance. It also includes regional texts, such as those produced by OHADA, the PECL, and the DCFR. Model contracts based on uniform texts, such as the ICC Model International Sales Contract, and developing neutral legal standards for international contracts, and the ITC Model Contracts for small firms. It also includes other guidance texts, such as the IBA Cross-Border Transactions Drafting Guide for International Sales Contracts. Finally, Chapter 4 of the guide deals with recurring legal issues arising in connection with sales contracts. This includes topics such as the use of electronic means and the Uniform Law on Electronic Contracting, the UN Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications, including in relation to the CISG and Limitation Convention. It also includes distribution contracts, agency agreements, and other topics as diverse as software, data, intellectual property issues, and counter-trade and barter transactions. The guide is expected to be adopted in July 2020 in the framework of the CISG 40th anniversary celebrations at UNCITRAL. In the next few months, the working group is expected to deliver a first draft of the guide, which will probably be discussed publicly in October on the occasion of the IBA Annual Conference in Rome. Next year, a revised draft of the guide will be submitted to the governing bodies of the UNIDROIT and the Hague Conference. The future guide will likely represent a milestone in the integration of the most important sources of international contract law. In times of legal diversity, it combines soft law and hard law without any discrimination. This endeavor counters today's fragmentation of international contract law and, at the same time, adds value to each instrument analyzed in the guide. Most importantly, we hope that the guide will serve as a useful tool for all those who operate in the international contract arena. Now, I come to the end of my presentation. Even remotely, I will be very happy to hear your thoughts on this exciting project. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in the 4th Annual UNCCA Seminar.
All right. So we remotely thank Mauro for this.
I guess from that, we can draw out a few issues and hear from you about any comments or questions you might have. My first observation would be, I find it interesting that Laurel says this is a document that's purely going to be a roadmap and it's not going to interpret these instruments, which I always wonder when someone says that, how can you not be interpreting these instruments if you're talking about them? My particular concern is that the way that the chapter on determination of which law applies is structured around whether parties have made a choice of law or haven't made a choice of law. And this is an area that's been of particular interest for me in the past, because quite often it's not clear whether parties have made a choice. And in particular, I'm thinking about situations where parties go to court and perhaps nobody realises that CISG or one of the other instruments might apply, and no one makes argument in regard to that. So traditionally, this has been viewed as perhaps a waiver or something of that nature, and the situation may be interpreted as the parties have chosen to opt out of CISG because of waiver. However, that issue and how it's handled under the CISG may differ to how it would have been handled under domestic law. So given that the chapter in the instrument that they're producing is structured around choice or no choice, I'd be interested to see how they handle that particular issue. Indeed, that's part of tied up with the error under the Play Court case, whereby the way the case is run is being seen as saying something about the nature of the party's intentions. The other thing that I'm interested in is also about how they will handle the scope issues related to the Unidroit principles and the CISG, because they do overlap quite a bit. And in regard to choice of law, obviously the Hague Principles and the Hague Convention on Choice of Law and the CISG and this issue about opting out. Perhaps I can open it up now for comments or questions and we can respond as best we can in Laurel's place.
I have two observations. First, if I can revert to my former role as a dean and comment on legal education, the one thing that I've seen have traction is when the Council of Chief Justices gets agitated about an omission from the core curriculum. They did that very effectively in relation to principles of statutory interpretation. And so if there is going to be a uniform adoption of principles of private international law, my suggestion is you agitate the Council of Chief Justices, who will then agitate the Council of Australian Law Deans. That seems to be the only effective mechanism. Commenting on the document, my observation is that it might be a risk in that the document might become a crutch and someone might use it thinking this is all there is. If I look at the section on carriage of goods, the instrument to which most states are parties is omitted because it's an IMO convention, not a UNCITRAL document. So missing from this list is the Hague History Rules, the LLC Convention and the COTIC Convention on rail transport, all of which impact on international sale of goods. So I just worry that the unknown unknowns might be perpetuated in this sort of a document. That's my opinion.
Yes, I think that's certainly one of the dangers, and saying that something is comprehensive when it really isn't comprehensive is always a problem. Tim, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up particularly Roger's themes. I gave him a bit of warning about this last night, in a way. Not knowing what he was going to talk about, but knowing that there'd be something very valuable contribution. If we think about a contract, I'll just make some preliminary comments. What is a contract? Why do we have contracts? And in a way, and I get this from some American, very basic contract principles I've been listening to recently. A contract is a very simple thing. Somebody's performing something, somebody's paying for it, and there's an allocation of risk. It's a very simple thing. And contracting parties, when they enter into a contract, do so with the best intention about how things might work out. And I suppose as lawyers, particularly as dispute resolution lawyers, generally things don't work out, and therefore we have to try and resolve it, whether it's in arbitration or whether it's in court proceedings. But the idea is to try and get some sort of certainty about the future. And there's a hidden premise in it that parties who come to a contract have relatively equal bargaining position. Former Chief Justice Gleeson gave a talk in the Banco Court the other day, which I went to, called the Bathurst Lecture, where he, his talk, with great respect to him, was really premised on the fact, well, you make a contract, you're bound by it, and if the answer that the contract provides is not good for one party, that's sort of bad luck. You went into it with your eyes open. And in a sense, that's the answer which he gives to the certainty problem. That's your contract. The law, I think, Parliament tries to deal with that in the domestic context by having things like the unfair contract term, which is saying, well, in reality, people don't actually enter into contracts on an equal footing, and therefore we need to now have legislation which says, well, terms are unfair, they're void. And the other response, I suppose, to pick up what Justice Derrick was talking about is class action and litigation funding, is we try and balance out the inequalities in contracting or the inequalities in parties' relationships with each other by allowing funders to come in to help those who can't afford the cost of litigation. And so how do we do that which is fair but doesn't create another problem? The question which I have is this, or the comment, and I'll throw this out to Roger, is our law at the moment is based upon the common law. Contract is a common law doctrine developed by the courts incrementally. And in a way, one can see that served us very well over the years. I mean, Australia's a stable society, or we have the rule of law. People generally think things are done pretty well. There's not a lot of complaints, but there are issues. But it is very domestically focused. So we have unfair contracts terms. We have the Australian consumer law, which deals with a whole lot of things, unconscionable conduct and so on. But we do depend upon the courts and the cases which people bring for the development of the law. The Attorney General's Department put out a paper, or certainly an idea a few years ago, about should we have a statutory basis for our contract law. If we look around the world, we see that a lot of countries have contract codes, and in some cases, like China, they've recently adopted the CISG as being the basis of their contract code. If we start to look in terms of Australia's role as a member of an international trading community, one of the criticisms that's made of Australia, particularly in the arbitration areas, people don't know what law arbitrators would apply if they came to Australia or Australian law, because it's a common law and it has all these statutory sort of impositions on it. The question really I have is, where do we want to be in 10 years' time? What's our vision for Australia in 10 years' time? Are we simply going to stay focused on a domestically based law which is developed in the ad hoc way by the common law, and accept, as it were, the status quo, to pick up the term used by Justice Derrington earlier, the status quo in terms of how we interact? Or are we going to look for something different? Do we have a different model in mind which is going to be a benefit to us domestically, but also as part of an international community and as a trading nation? If so, what is that vision and how do we get there? And I think some of the points which you've raised are all points which really require that question to be asked. And perhaps I throw it to you and then the other members of the panel and the seminar.
I'm sure people in this room might be views on that. So we did do a discussion paper in 2012, looking at boldly one of the questions was, should we have a code of contracts in Australia? It's developed. Part of it was a federal issue. Part of it was the fact that you have a variety of different rules and approaches to contract depending on what stage you're in. So partly the thought was, well, maybe we should try and overcome that in some way. I talked to Chief Justice French about it. He said, well, we have an Australian contract law. We say what it is in the High Court. And I said, yeah, but I mean, Parliament's also have a role, and there's a whole plethora of interpretations going around there. So that was one thought. The other thing was the international perspective too, because we looked at and I quickly averted this in my opening remarks, the extent to which people actually understand or take up some of these international rules that are more widely picked up in our region and other countries, didn't seem to be a reticence to do that. So with small, medium-sized enterprises, with a lot of solicitors and law firms, people simply did not opt into these rules, or they opted out of these rules. They avoided a lot. CISG, for example, was not used widely. And we did a bit of it was a pretty rough look around and talking to people, but we were looking at some way in which we could encourage that to occur. So, you know, this idea of trying to, I guess, come up with a code of contract. We also talked about a US-style statement of the law of contract. I talked to the Law Reform Commission. I said they prefer to throw themselves out the window than get into the restatement of the law stuff. But whether there was room for clarity of that sort, with an eye to the international perspective and an eye to the federal balkanisation problem. But it's fair to say we ran into a whole bunch of problems about leadership, sort of the Rudd Gillard stuff, changing attorneys general who didn't were preoccupied with other things, and it sort of died. But I do think it's the question you raise is pertinent and very relevant and needs to be put back on the agenda. Actually, I think that's my view.
I'm just briefly going into this before we go back to talking about the project and people's views, because we're running short of time now, although we perhaps can take a little longer schedule because we've run early to time. I think I agree with what you're saying. Essentially, the idea of codifying, while it might be quite foreign to our way of thinking in terms of contract law, it does have the very interesting prospect of making our law much more accessible. And we talk a lot about, let's make things more efficient, let's improve things in terms of how we fit in the international picture. Well, accessibility is a big part of that, and from the outsider's perspective, as Tim mentioned, looking into Australia, where do you find this stuff? Well, pick up a contract textbook and sit down for a few hours because you're going to be in for a long haul. And also the other thing is it allows you to have a better framework. And we see this in other jurisdictions whereby the law is more organised. So when you do come to the time where you want to implement a change, it's easier to show where that's going to fit in and how it's going to fit in when you actually have a framework in the terms of a codification. Or perhaps, and this perhaps is something that we can take from this plethora of instruments out there, a lot of the time what's being done is the idea that you put a soft law instrument out there and in terms of internationally, it could be perhaps some sort of principles or something like that, and see how it goes. And then later on, if it does turn out to be popular, there's always the possibility that it might be turned into something more of a hard law or a model law that then gets implemented as a hard law. So there's sort of a way you can get there without hitting people with a sledgehammer. And perhaps the idea of a restatement of laws in Australia would have been a good one, and perhaps that's something we need to look to in the future, because that then allows us to show how it fits with international principles and raise awareness at the same time. Sorry, yes, please.
Make one comment sort of contrary to that. The strongest arbitral centre in the world is still London. The fastest growing arbitral centre is Singapore, both common law. And I think there's a lot of evidence that, I think as Lord Mansfield put it, the fecundity for which the common law is renowned gives it its attractiveness as an arbitral base.
Can I just make one comment, and in the context of the sort of codification versus the discussion, and it's really a question of the group. How are we dealing with or thinking about technology transactions or commercial technology contracts in this context? Because whether we think of common law or whether we think of codification, I'm sitting here talking to a client, and look, I've primarily been in Newcastle, and they're saying, while you're debating this whole topic, technology has completely moved on. I've lost my deal, and I'm going to download from the internet a few clauses and put together a contract for buying that software or developing that system. So it's a practical, incredibly urgent issue in terms of how, and I agree that I think our law schools or our professional development needs to look at some sort of continuing education in terms of private law in that context. But it's a challenge, and it's a challenge when you've got a client or a CIO or whoever it happens to be standing in front of you, rattling chains.
Yeah, because they're not just buying an off-the-shelf product. We're talking about a situation where they actually want to negotiate with an offshore provider.
Oh, completely.
Exactly.
Oh, and you might have an SAP, or it might be and they're saying, well, here are our standard terms from Germany. I mean, so there's a multiple of issues that you're dealing with, and in some cases it's just you're all getting heads in the room to try and work out this is, or it could be a long-term outsourcing agreement, a marriage for 10 years. How do we make it practically work in this sort of rapidly changing environment?
And it's a problem with both as well, because it's lack of awareness of international instruments. It's a problem both here and also with our international counterparts.
Incredibly, yeah, I agree.
I had a matter which involved a mining boom that fell off a truck at Port Hedland, and because of the nature of the contract between the parties, the contractor was, it ended up being covered by Dutch internal road transport law.
We would have thought that.
Something fell back of a truck and blocked the highway from Perth to Darwin. Because, and how did this happen? It said, oh, well, they're a Dutch contractor and they had a standard form and we signed it.
Yeah.
Hello, report. It's kind of a case about Dutch law. But yes, but partly because they didn't know what to do, they did that as they had an in-house counsel looked at it and said, well, I know this is the standard terms that they've been doing his work in this sector for a while. I'm sure it's fine. But they didn't know enough to say, well, get on the phone and say, look, we'd rather agree a neutral instrument rather than one that you're seeking to impose by contract of religion. Even with the, there was a $2.5 million contract to move this thing around. It's not just to buy something off the internet for a busy credit card.
But you know, we talk about buying stuff off the internet for a credit card, and it can seem like a very small contract. And wow, I've seen some things go horribly wrong. So you know that you get the full spectrum.
Yeah,
So.
Question off the back.
Hi, my name's Marina from White Case. I remember reading a lot of the submissions to that inquiry, and this was, what was it, 2012 or 2013, so a while ago now, but it occurs to me now in the context of this discussion that there's an even larger practical problem of selling it to the community of companies that will ultimately have to bear the cost of this change, because a lot of the larger law firms that made submissions actually said, well, our clients don't want this because of the transition costs. They're too high. So even though I agree that it is a good idea, the thing is those who feel that it's a good idea really have to sell it to the end users. And I don't know whether you get the same response if you put it out to submissions 5 years, 6 years later, but that was a big issue at that time.
Can I just make a couple of comments there? I mean, I learned a lot about large law firms when I was secretary to one is that they like the status quo and they like complexity because they can charge much more to their clients. They quite like regulatory arbitrage, for example. They don't really. So for a range of reasons, I'm not guided necessarily by what I hear from large law firms. I'm more interested in picking particular people who I trust and getting their views on the issue.
Further to that, part of my role has been talking to some large law firms and also to some of their clients who have a lot of recurring sales internationally. Quite often when they hear about some of the benefits that they could possibly obtain from it, that does pique their interest in it. It's not all about just transition costs, and there are some advantages that they possibly could gain. So the other part of it is, it's not really so much as a change that they have to embrace, but it's just a choice that's already in existence that they're not utilising. So whether it's worth them exploring that and paying the learning costs of becoming familiar with it or not, that's quite key. The other aspect of it, of course, is from the educational side. If they've already learned about it at university, it isn't viewed in the same way. And we find that in those countries where the domestic law does more closely align with the international instruments, that there is less of a reluctance to use those instruments and to choose those laws to the advantage in many cases of their clients. So that relationship between opting out and awareness is a real one, and we do find that that has an impact.
And of course, Australian parties are generally speaking rule takers when it comes to international contracts. They're imposed on us. We want our clients to be here in Australia because they're often dealing with larger and international players abroad providing legal services, whereas they're a domestic player only here. And what's the alternative to rule taking? You can't rule make and impose our law on the counterparty. You're not going to be able to do that. But you have to then therefore go to a neutral choice. That's your bargain. It's either accept the rule that's being imposed or go to a neutral rule. I think that's one of the benefits for the client. That otherwise they find themselves in litigation where they not only have to have Australian lawyers to pay, they've got to hire a bunch of Dutch lawyers to explain the contract, to explain the contract that they signed.
Not having to hire legal experts for our law is a big advantage. I think we have time for one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi, my name is Randa Sassadon. I just wanted to make a comment about the practical application of this project. Some of the keywords that came to me was a roadmap, straightforward language and flowcharts. I wonder if the working group would embrace the technology of today. Increasingly there are apps for everything, and if there could be some sort of inbuilt intellectual matrix that people could use to access this information. I've got a contract with such and such. And more than just your Control F, find a word, search. At the end of the day, it's the practitioners in practice that we want to use it. So it has to be user-friendly. Practitioners don't have the benefit of the working group's intelligence in their office to consult. So I have seen some legal softwares developing with this intellectual capability, and I think with the way that we're moving, that it would not be unrealistic or impossible to develop such a tool.
That's good feedback. Yeah. Because, for example, the 2012 document, you download as a PDF, there's no hyperlinks to any instruments. HTML's been around for 5 years.
Yeah, and that's a great suggestion. We'll pass that on along with the other comments as well. I think that would be interested to hear that. And I think there is a move to create documents with hyperlinks. I've seen a few examples where they've done that in these kinds of bodies, but going to the app is one step.
We'll drag them kicking and screaming into 1990s.
Functional equivalence. All right, thank you so much everybody for your comments, and please, if you have any further remarks that you want to pass on, I'm happy to do that. Thank you for your attention today.
Now, I also noticed Laura mentioned that the new guideline will include a lot broader topics than just what the CIFG covers, for example. So we'll do the current commerce as well, and that's something that then our next panel will handle. Hopefully, it just made me wonder when I heard Laura saying, "Well, the guideline is expected to come out around 2020." And I had the same dilemma as you did. Are we going to still deal with the exact same environment at that time? Or what exactly are we proposing to regulate, or even just to guide through soft law? Because that field is changing so quickly. Regulation is always reactive rather than proactive. And when it comes to technology, that's a huge challenge, I think, and it's a really difficult task to do. So that's some food for thought for the next panel as well. Before we go out for the coffee break, and I'm really strong here because catering hasn't arrived yet. I was just thinking, because education came up several times. Perhaps this would be a good opportunity, and I'm putting out on the spotlight again, to practically just share with the audience, because some people may, but the majority may not know about one program that ANCA is running, the UN Laws program. And we actually have a couple of people who participated in that. So that's ANCA's way of contributing to education in one way, to send people to the Yale Shrine, and Alan will elaborate on that a little bit, if you may.
I was going to speak about that in the next part. I was going to take 4 or 5 minutes in the first session to show you photographs and talk about the UN laws that we've had. I said 40 students, but we've had 37 students that we've taken to the UN so far. Most of them I would say from the University of Queensland, because I used to brought back to do that. But they're welcome from all around Australia. We have people from Canberra University, Curtin University, University of Sydney, University of Newcastle, La Trobe University.
Don't you have one for Monash?
But I said La Trobe. and I'm sure I'm missing a couple, Wollongong University, a PhD student from there. Tim asked me 2013, how about you become the education officer and have this UN Laws project? And I experimented by having 2 students from my university. I tried to get funding, couldn't get funding. And lo and behold, if you ask 2 students if they want to go to the UN in the EU, I'll find their own. But also, again, with my former Dean, Justice Sarah Gerritsen, we've managed to get $2,000 per student over the last few years. The 3 students I had this year had no funding. The 3 students I'm going to have the end year, they get $2,500 each, because we've got some funding for that. Newcastle has given their students $1,000 each. Because it's a bit unfair if you can only get the rich students to come along, you can subsidise and get their applications. That would be terrific. I have a slide which I will show you about all the comments saying, fabulous, great. I always say to the students, you don't realise how slow and tedious the sessions are. Because I've been to every Woodley Group 4 session for the last 4 or 5 years. But when it's your first time there and you're a student, you look around and you're being introduced to the chair, because I try to bring the chair up. I introduced them to Anna in April, Anna Julia Brett, and Luca Castellani and Gisela, who's always been chair of our working group. And it's sort of starstruck. And I say, well, I told you it was starting to do this there. No, it was very exciting. And they love it. And it's one of the best things I've ever done is to get my students, but also students from all over the country. I just wish we could get greater participation from the other universities. And I think that's so but I will show you some slides and rush through them, which is, I wanted to take 4 or 5 minutes to say exactly that.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think that's one way, just going back to your dynamic, that's also a tiny way of giving an insight into how the Australia is working and how those legal instruments are being developed. And it gives a completely different understanding, at least to those who participate and watch, because, well, on one hand, you see how tedious and slow the process can be, but you also get a technical understanding of what it means to actually develop a legal instrument at that level. And that helps a lot. Now, of course, that's a very tiny bit, and there are only a couple of people who have the benefit of experiencing that. But then we can have that ripple effect, hopefully. The bad part is that it all depends on our individual enthusiasm and passion for this field, right? So when Alan is investing a lot of his time and is trying to get funding to send people, Lisa and myself are doing the BISMUD, also doing the UNCITRAL working group presences. These are all very resource intensive activities.
But very worthwhile. Students love it. Last night we had a celebration, if I can break, that we won the Jessup Moot competition, and we had a celebration for those students. And they're starry-eyed and they're very happy, and they've had that experience in Washington, as well as being able to go to New York and Vienna, which Anka can do, and things to be congratulated for getting this going and supporting that. I just hope we get more students from around the country. I haven't had one. When I write to the deans of the law schools, I think they think there's a trick in it and that we want to charge them something, and at least 3/4 of them think it's junk mail. But I have had positive reactions from others. We've got to get the word out there that this is a real opportunity, and if you can get your law school to put $500 or $1,000 towards it, even better for the students. Or one day, I think the aim was to have some type of sufficient money to put towards it. Now, we're nowhere near that, I think.
Lovely. And we have, in the last panel, we have actually 2 students who have come with me to working group 2 in Vienna and New York, one of them twice.
Yes.
And they're going to be a very sort of personal account of what it meant.
Because it's such a high-level experience, and I think part of the reluctance also comes from missing that lower level that Justin mentioned, that how can a word that is existing in this internationalized, globalized environment function without compulsory international education. So not having that basis also triggers reluctance to that higher level international experience. How does this fit into our curriculum? Why should we send students there when we don't even do the basic that they need to actually know what they're doing there? So it is a combination, and I'm really grateful for your comment about sort of the, I don't say the back door, but how exactly you can idea your currents and finding the way to have that influence into shaping the curriculum, because from where we sit in academia, it's so management driven, and it's all about financial viability.
Just don't ever suggest that you want to reopen the Priestley 11.
There are initiatives, I mean, there are compulsory subjects beyond the Priestley 11, but universities need a a push from accreditation bodies or council of law deans to actually put something on that list, and without touching the frisbee, that just to say, you cannot live without international legal education. So I know there was one more comment and question, but
It was more in relation to and I'm not saying our organisation is anywhere close to the community of, sorry, I'm Jessica from the University of Adelaide, Alan, I need to talk to you. Which is to have training modules that are available online that anybody can do in their own time. Now, for busy practitioners, but in terms of getting and helping lecturers and people going through, maybe that's another opportunity to have something available online relatively freely that people can do, maybe not through an app if we're still struggling with hyperlinks, but videos and things like that too. Yeah, that's just a
food
suggestion.
for thought for our government as well, perhaps. Thank you. Nothing about it. Well, thank you everyone for your patient attention. Thank you for the panel, and please join us for coffee. Please feel free to continue the discussion. We have about half an hour before we meet the
So nice to see you.